was freezing. The only heat came from a pot-bellied stove in the corner of a damp, drafty barracks in Verdun, France. But the temperature inside that room wasn't just physical, it was political, and it was at a boiling point. Gathered around a simple wooden table were the most powerful men in the Western world. Dwight Eisenhower, the supreme commander, whose face was gray with exhaustion. Omar Bradley, the GI's general, who was watching his front lines collapse. And Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery, the British hero who had just spent the last hour lecturing the Americans on their incompetence. The situation was catastrophic. The German army, a force everyone said was dead, had just launched the greatest surprise attack in history. They had punched a hole in the Allied lines 50 miles wide. American units were surrendering, tanks were burning, and the road to Antwerp was wide open. Montgomery had a solution, but it was a solution that curdled the blood of every American in the room. He wanted to retreat. He wanted to tidy up the lines. He wanted to cede ground, regroup, and wait. It was the sensible, logical, cautious military move. Eisenhower turned to the man sitting at the end of the table, the man they called Old Blood and Guts, the man they had almost fired 3 times for being too reckless. "George," Eisenhower asked, "how long will it take you to turn your entire Third Army 90 degrees and attack the German flank?" The room went silent. The logistics were impossible. To move an entire army, 130,000 men and thousands of tanks across icy roads in the middle of a blizzard would take weeks. Montgomery prepared to smirk. Patton didn't blink. He leaned forward, lighting a cigar, and dropped the sentence that would change the course of the 20th century. "I can attack with 3 divisions in 48 hours." The British laughed. The Americans scoffed. They thought he was grandstanding. They thought he was insane. But they were wrong. This is the story of the greatest logistical miracle in the history of warfare. This is the story of how George S. Patton not just saved the U.S. Army at the Battle of the Bulge, he saved the alliance itself. And he did it by doing the one thing Montgomery said was impossible. To understand why Patton's promise was so insane, we first have to understand the sheer scale of the disaster he was walking into. Mid-December 1944, the Ardennes Forest. They called it the Ghost Front. It was a quiet sector, rugged hills, dense pine forests, and deep snow. The Allies used it as a resting ground for battered divisions recovering from heavy fighting, and a training ground for green troops who had just arrived from the States. Intelligence said the Germans were finished. The Third Reich was bleeding out. Their fuel was gone, their air force was grounded, and their best men were dead. Eisenhower and his staff believed that Christmas 1944 would be the end of the war. They were already planning the victory parades. But across the line, in the mist and fog, a monster was gathering. Adolf Hitler had stripped the Eastern Front. He had scraped together the last reserves of the Wehrmacht, the 6th Panzer Army, the 5th Panzer Army, the elite SS divisions. Over 200,000 men and nearly 1,000 tanks were hiding in the tree lines, engines off to avoid detection, waiting for the signal. Hitler's plan was madness. Operation Wacht am Rhein. He would punch through the weak American lines in the Ardennes, cross the Meuse River, and capture the port of Antwerp. It would split the British and American armies. He believed he could force a negotiated peace. 05:30 a.m., December 16th, the world ended. A barrage of 1,600 German artillery guns shattered the silence. Following the shells came the ghosts. German stormtroopers dressed in white camouflage, emerging from the mist like nightmares. Behind them roared the tigers and panthers. The American 106th Infantry Division, fresh and inexperienced, was disintegrated. In the Schnee-Eifel, 2 entire regiments were surrounded. It would become the largest mass surrender of U.S. troops in the European theater. Chaos reigned. Communications were cut by German commandos dressed in American uniforms, Otto Skorzeny's Corporation Greif. They changed road signs, cut telephone wires, and spread rumors. No one knew where the front line was. General Omar Bradley was in Paris. When the reports came in, he dismissed them as a spoiling attack, a minor skirmish. He was wrong. It wasn't a skirmish. It was the Wehrmacht's dying scream, and it was deafening. As the American front collapsed, a secondary crisis was emerging, a crisis of command. For months, Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery had been arguing that Eisenhower's broad front strategy was a mistake. Monty wanted a single, focused thrust into Germany, led, of course, by himself. He believed the Americans were tactically sloppy, disorganized, and undisciplined. Now, with the American center broken, Montgomery felt vindicated. The German advance was so deep that it physically cut communication between Omar Bradley's headquarters in the south and his armies in the north. Eisenhower, in a moment of desperate pragmatism, made a controversial call. He transferred command of all U.S. troops north of the Bulge, including the 1st and 9th Armies, to Montgomery. Monty didn't just take command. He strutted into American headquarters like a substitute teacher taking over a rowdy classroom. One British officer described Montgomery's arrival at the U.S. 1st Army HQ as a breath of fresh air. The Americans described it differently. They called it humiliating. Montgomery immediately ordered reorganization. He stopped the counterattacks. He shortened the lines. His logic was sound. You cannot attack when you are off balance. He wanted to absorb the blow, wait for them to run out of fuel, and then counterattack weeks later. But in the South, there was a different kind of general, a man who didn't believe in absorbing blows. He believed in delivering them. General George S. Patton was currently commanding the 3rd Army in the Saar region, far to the south of the Bulge. He was preparing for his own offensive into Germany. But Patton had something the other commanders lacked, an uncanny, almost psychic intuition. While Bradley was dismissing the initial attacks as minor, Patton was in his headquarters looking at the map. He saw the German troop movements. He saw the weather. He turned to his staff and said, "This is it. They are throwing everything they have at us." Patton didn't wait for orders. This is the key to the entire story. While Eisenhower was still debating the scale of the attack, Patton was already stopping his offensive in the Saar. He was already telling his staff, "We're going to have to turn north." On December 18th, before he was even asked, Patton called his brilliant G4, Colonel Molly Williams, and his G3, General Hal Gay. He told them, "Start planning to move the 3rd Army north to Luxembourg. I want 3 possible axes of advance, and I want them ready yesterday." His staff thought he was hallucinating. Disengage from a fight in the Saar? Turn an entire army 90 degrees? Drive over icy roads? It was logistical suicide. Patton just smiled. "They'll call us soon," he said, "and when they do, we'll be the only ones ready." December 19th, 1944, the Verdun Barracks. This meeting is legendary in military history. Eisenhower walked in looking like a dead man walking. He opened the conference with a grim statement. "The present situation is to be regarded as one of opportunity for us and not of disaster. There will be only cheerful faces at this table." But there were no cheerful faces. The Americans were embarrassed. The British were condescending. Montgomery spoke first. He laid out the grim reality. The Germans were moving fast. The 1st Army was holding on by a thread. He advocated a defensive posture. We must stabilize. We must not become unhinged. To Monty, the American cowboy tactics had led to this mess. Now it was British discipline. Then Eisenhower turned to Patton. Ike knew asking Patton to help was a risk. Patton hated losing ground, but Ike needed a miracle. He needed pressure taken off the North, or the Germans would reach the River Meuse. "George, I want you to go to Luxembourg and take charge of the battle. When can you start?" This was the trap. In standard military doctrine, disengaging an army from combat takes at least 72 hours. Moving them takes another week. Preparing a counterattack takes days more. Any reasonable general would have said, "I can be ready in 2 weeks." Patton replied, "As soon as you're through with me, I can leave. I can attack with 3 divisions in 48 hours. The reaction was immediate. Laughter. Not polite laughter, but the laughter of disbelief. One British officer openly snorted. Even Eisenhower, Patton's old friend, looked annoyed. "Don't be fatuous, George. This is serious." But Patton wasn't joking. He stood up. "I'm not being fatuous, Ike. I've already made my plans. My staff is already working. I have a code word ready. If I telephone my headquarters and say, 'Play ball,' 3 divisions will start moving north immediately." The room went dead silent. Montgomery looked at Patton like he was a lunatic. To promise such a movement was technically impossible. It involved moving 133,000 motor vehicles over a road network that was covered in black ice, crossing the supply lines of other armies in total radio silence during a blizzard. If Patton failed, the Germans would flank him. The Third Army would be destroyed. The war would drag on into 1946. Eisenhower looked at Patton. He saw the fire in his eyes. He realized that Patton had anticipated this days ago. "Go," he said. "Give them hell." What followed was the most complex logistical maneuver in the history of the U.S. Army. Patton stormed out of the conference room, got into his staff car, and shouted to his driver, "Drive like hell." He radioed his chief of staff, General Hobart Gay, "Play ball." Instantly, the Third Army began to convulse. Imagine a city the size of St. Louis picking itself up and moving 100 miles in 2 days on single-lane country roads in sub-zero temperatures. The 4th Armored Division, Patton's favorite hammer, had to disengage from a firefight, reverse, and drive north. The 26th and 80th Infantry Divisions had to march through snow that was knee-deep. Patton was everywhere. He stood at crossroads, acting as a traffic cop. He yelled at truck drivers. He fined soldiers for not wearing helmets. He threatened officers who lagged behind. He knew that speed was the only armor they had. But the biggest enemy wasn't the Germans. It was the weather. The blizzard was relentless. Allied aircraft, the P-47s, Thunderbolts that were the terror of German tanks, were grounded. Patton couldn't see what was ahead of him. So he did something only Patton would do. He ordered his chaplain, Colonel James O'Neill, to write a prayer for good weather. "Sir, this isn't a standard request," the chaplain said. "I don't care. Get it printed. Every man in the Third Army gets one." The prayer read, "Almighty and most merciful Father, we humbly beseech Thee to restrain these immoderate rains. Grant us fair weather for battle." Whether it was divine intervention or just a high-pressure system, the Allied skies cleared on December 23rd. The Allied Air Force took to the skies, but before that, Patton's men had to fight on the ground. While Patton raced north, a small town in Belgium had become the center of the world, Bastogne. 7 roads converged on this town. The Germans needed it to move their supplies. But inside the town, the battered 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles, were holding out. They were surrounded, out of ammo, out of food, and freezing to death. When the German commander demanded their surrender, General Anthony Macaulay gave the famous one-word reply, "Nuts." But bravery doesn't stop tanks. The 101st was being squeezed. They needed relief, and they needed it now. Patton's Third Army slammed into the southern flank of the German Seventh Army like a freight train. This wasn't the clean, fast war Patton loved. This was a slugfest. Every village was a fortress. Every tree line hid a German 88mm gun. The 4th Armored Division led the spearhead. They called the road to Bastogne the Corridor of Death. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, the man the modern M1 tank is named after, was leading the charge in his tank, Thunderbolt. On December 26th, 4 miles from Bastogne, Abrams made a decision. He ignored the orders to secure his flanks. He ordered his tanks to charge straight through the German lines. He radioed, "We're going in." They blasted through the village of Aisne. They ran over German infantry. They took point-blank hits. At 4:50 p.m., a young American engineer from the 101st saw a tank emerging from the tree line. He raised his bazooka, thinking it was a Tiger. Then he saw the white star. Patton had kept his promise. He had broken the siege. Patton had done the impossible. He had moved an army in dead winter, pivoted 90 degrees, and defeated the German flank. It was a masterpiece of generalship. But the political war wasn't over. On January 7, 1945, Field Marshal Montgomery held a press conference. It was intended to explain the battle to the world. In front of the world's press, Montgomery took credit for halting the German offensive. He described the battle as if he were the puppet master, saving the disorganized Americans. He barely mentioned Patton. He made it sound as if the U.S. Army had been saved by British intervention. The backlash was volcanic. Bradley was furious. Patton was apoplectic. He threatened to resign. The vindication Patton deserved was being stolen by the man who told him it couldn't be done. Eisenhower had to intervene to stop the alliance from shattering. He practically forced Montgomery to retract his tone. But history knew the truth. The Germans knew the truth. After the war, German General Hasso von Montefol, who commanded the 5th Panzer Army, said that Patton's turn to the north was the decisive moment. He called it brilliant. He said no other Allied general could execute that maneuver with such speed. In the end, the Battle of the Bulge was the bloodiest battle in American history. 19,000 Americans killed. 89,000 casualties. But without that meeting in Verdun, without that moment of absolute, terrifying confidence in a cold barracks room, it could have been much worse. If Montgomery's cautious plan had been followed, Bastogne would have fallen. The war would have dragged on. The Iron Curtain might have fallen much further west. They called George Patton a loose cannon. They called him dangerous. They called him crazy. But on December 19, 1944, when the world was falling apart, crazy was exactly what the Allies needed. Patton was right. Montgomery was wrong. And the proof is written in the snow of the Ardennes. What do you think? Was this Patton's greatest moment, or was Montgomery right to be cautious? Let us know in the comments below. And make sure to subscribe for more untold stories of World War II.